On this debut episode of Cinescares, I'm going to take a look at Blackmagic's venerable 4K pocket cinema camera and ask if it has value for money in 2023, and ask if you, as an independent filmmaker, should be thinking about picking one of these cameras up. All that and more coming up next. Hey everybody, thank you for stopping by the channel and checking out the very first episode of Cinescares. My name is JDV and I make horror movies for a living. I've been making movies since the early 90s. My very first feature film was way back in 1994 called Deadeye. It got worldwide distribution, actually shot on 16mm film, and I've been making movies, short movies, commercials, and all that kind of jazz ever since. So all of my reviews and anything that I talk about are going to be coming from the viewpoint of an actual independent filmmaker who makes his actual living making independent horror movies, essentially, although I do dabble in sci-fi. And so just everything is going to be coming from that. There's not going to be a lot of tests, charts, and things like that. But whether or not something is practical and whether something will give you an edge in terms of selling your film or getting your film seen. All right, all that out of the way, let's take a quick look at the Blackmagic Pocket 4K cinema camera, which has been around now for a little over 4 years, maybe even 5 years. It's been out for a very long time. I've owned this particular camera for about 2.5 years, so kind of down the middle in terms of how long some people have owned these. These, of course, are incredibly popular cameras for film schools and low-budget filmmakers for a couple of reasons. So let me get right into the pros before I get to the cons, and then I'll tell you whether or not I think you guys should buy this if you're looking at making an independent horror movie or something like that. The first thing is, of course, its price. When this thing came out 4 years ago, it was $1,300, and flash forward to 4 years later, and it's still $1,300. This is one of the very few cameras that is that old that you can still buy brand new from B&H. And yes, you can still buy this thing brand new for $1,300, and they go for around $1,000 to $1,100 if you're going to buy these on the used market. I did buy this used for just about that same exact price from B&H, like I said, 2 years ago. So these things have kept their value remarkably well. And of course, if you buy this thing new, you're going to get DaVinci Resolve. It's a program I don't tend to use for a couple reasons. One, I don't use it as an editing program, and because I really don't love LUTs or working with them or color grading, I tend to use baked in type profiles, which is something that this camera can do but does not do well. I'll get a little bit into that in terms of the cons. But it offers great value for money. At least it did 4 years ago. In fact, it offered such great value for money that it probably did change the trajectory of the industry in terms of bigger companies were forced to put out cameras that at least could match the specs of this. And then, of course, 4 years later, almost all the cameras do match these specs and, in fact, far exceed them. Now, the Micro Four Thirds mount is either a blessing or a curse. One of the blessings, of course, is that you can adapt virtually every other lens ever made for the camera. I think you'll have a hard time with the E-mount lenses. Apparently, you can do it. I've never tried to, but Canon FDs, Canon EOS, of course, any Micro Four Thirds native, you could Nikon, anamorphic lenses. You can get a huge variety of lenses for this camera, and that is absolutely a strength, particularly if you are already invested in some other type of glass. And if you do choose the route of going native in terms of the lenses, there are a plethora of really, really good lenses that you can get for the camera. I own several of them, and I'll be doing reviews on those in other episodes. But there's a lot of really, really good native glass for the Micro Four Thirds mount, and it is almost universally going to be smaller, lighter, and cheaper than the S35 or full frame equivalent. So that is, in my mind, a strength if you are a new person jumping in the industry, or if you don't have a lot of money to spend and really are not going to be able to afford that really high-end full frame glass. So to me, that is a positive. One of the other pluses for this camera system is its menu, which many people claim to be the best of any video camera. I won't go so far as to say that, in part because there is such a huge reliance on the touchscreen, which can be a real pain in the butt if you're wearing gloves or if you're outside at all, or if you have fat arthritic numbly old man fingers like I do. So I got it's a little bit down, and I also think that Panasonic's menu system is just better, period. But when you combine that with their more dedicated buttons, I think Panasonic is, at least in my mind, #1 for menu system. Blackmagic is a firm #2 in my mind, and for many people, it is the best menu system of all camera. And of course, their menu system does bleed over into their higher end camera. So if you want to get the 6K or the 12K Pro, you're going to see a very similar menu system in those cameras. So that's a nice thing too if you want to bump up. But of course, Panasonic has the same thing. I'd say Canon has the 3rd best menu system, followed by a distant 4th place by OM, Olympus, and Sony. I know shoot Nikon, so I have no idea. But perhaps the best reason to pick up this camera and use it in 2023 is the image quality coming out of it. No matter how hard or easy a camera is to use, you're probably going to be a little bit more likely to put up with its flaws, and all cameras do have their flaws, even very expensive ones. And the fact is that this camera makes a very nice, cinematic, pleasing to the eye image. Whether it's the nice smooth roll-off or the grain level of the image that it produces, it's just a little bit of softness, so you can get away without using a whole bunch of a glimmer glass or things like that, filters over the lenses. It still makes a very nice image. Maybe it's because it shoots at true 24, maybe because it's the Codex. There's some kind of special magic in this Blackmagic camera, and for the price, if you have the time and the energy to learn the camera and you have good lenses and know what you're doing, you can produce images that are every bit as good as almost any other camera that you can buy. That is the massive strength of this camera, is that fact that it makes really pretty pictures. Well, no camera's perfect, and Blackmagic Pocket 4K cinema camera certainly is not perfect. And I think right off the bat, the fact that it's called a cinema camera, you have a lot of videos out there say, it's a true cinema camera, it's a true cinema camera. No, it's really not a true cinema camera. The only way that it's a real cinema camera is the fact that it's not a hybrid camera. Nobody on earth has ever used this film as their primary stills camera. It does not have in-body stabilization at all. It does not have continual autofocus. With EF glass that's native, if you have an adapter like this Metabones on here, you can get it to focus if you tap the button, but even that is unreliable. So no autofocus, no in-body stabilization, and no real ability to take stills means it's not a hybrid camera. It's just a movie camera. But to call this a cinema camera, that stretches the truth a little bit. I think, what is it on? There's 6 buttons on this camera, 7, something like that. There's not a whole lot of buttons on this camera. There's no built-in ND filters on this camera. That would be something that would be nice. This little phantom microphone input is nice, but that's not going to be found on any higher-end cinema camera. It's kind of a tweener. It's sort of a cinema camera, but not really. So it's a little bit false advertising in that regard. And also, no cinema camera would be this weird shape. The shape of the camera doesn't bother me because it's closer to a hybrid DSLR camera, which is actually my favorite body size. And because the screen does not flip out, doesn't tilt, doesn't go this way, doesn't do anything like that, you're stuck looking at it like this. So if you start to go up here, or if you have to be over here or anything like that, it becomes a massive, massive negative. And if you have bad eyesight, the way I do, now I've had bad eyes since day one, but they haven't gotten any better as I've gotten older. Having the screen size is a nice plus, but the fact that it doesn't tilt or flip is a huge negative. It is a big reason why more modern cameras like the GH6, S5, anything from Sony, are going to destroy this camera in terms of usability, even though it has a big, beautiful screen. And as far as I know, you can no longer get the tilty flip-off thing that you could get from third parties. That is no longer available. So if you buy this camera, you are going to be stuck with it just like this, meaning that you will probably want to pick up an external monitor, which is something I hate to do when I'm running and gunning. So yeah, speaking of running and gunning, if you're someone like me who does essentially make all of their movies on very low budgets, you're not getting permits, you don't have giant crews, you're going to be running and gunning. This is not a run and gun camera. It's just not. It's not weatherproof at all, even though I have shot with this in really bad weather. Yeah, I know that guys like Frame Voyager have taken this camera all over the world, but again, it is not rated for weather. That's a big negative. The flippy screen, big negative. The fact that you really do have to rig it out at least this much so you can get a better battery situation, because the battery is just absolutely awful on this camera. There are no built-in ND filters like you can get in the 6K version of the camera. There are a lot of things that are kind of against this camera being a run and gun type camera, including the fact that it has now a very old 4.3 sensor in it. Micro Four Thirds does a lot of things great, but low light is not one of them. And while this camera does do very well for a Micro Four Thirds camera in low light, particularly if you have a speed booster and the Sigma 18-35 lens, you're still not going to be able to touch the performance of any of the modern full frame cameras. Now, anything from Sony, anything from Panasonic at this point, anything really even from Canon is going to beat this in low light. It's not horrible, it's not a disaster. It's far better than shooting on 16mm film or 8mm film if you were thinking about doing that. But it's going to give you a lot more grain a lot quicker than a full frame camera would. So even though I like the image from the Blackmagic just a little bit better than the S5, it really is neck and neck, which is a testimony to this camera. But the fact is that the ease of use is just so much higher on the S5 series that in the end I could not recommend this camera over something like the G8-6 or the S5 series or really any of the Canon or Sony's. It's just the ease of use issue is a real thing. The fact that it doesn't have weather sealing, doesn't have IBIS, and does not have a tilty flippy screen are really bad deal breakers. One other thing to note is that this camera only has one SD card slot. That is a negative for me. It's actually one of the reasons why it's a big negative against the GH6 in my opinion, is the fact that it has only one SD card slots. Unless you are going for really high res stuff, it really does not make sense. And for me, the ability to have two allows double redundancy and or very long recording times. That is a bigger advantage to me than the higher bit rates, frame rates, or whatever you could have using other type of cards, including outboard SSDs. So that is actually a pretty big negative for this camera. And to wrap this review up, part of the reason why I probably wouldn't jump into this is that Micro Four Thirds is not dead, but the longevity of the mount is in serious doubt. Olympus OM1 really isn't making any forward strides in terms of their sensor technology. They're putting out some new lenses, but mostly for birders and wildlife type people. The GH6 is a very flawed camera, interesting camera, maybe better than this, maybe not, depending on your usage. For me, it probably would be better because it does have a tilty flippy screen. It's probably a little bit better in low light and has a great IBIS. Those are all things that I really like as a running gunner. But the fact is that might be the last Micro Four Thirds camera from Panasonic. So, you know, there's a lot of reasons not to jump in. On the other hand, you could pick up Micro Four Thirds lenses all day long now for a lot cheaper than you could have 4 years ago. So if you're on a super tight budget, maybe this is something that you take a look at. All right, so if you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up on the way out the door. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Cinescares. Mwah!
Be sure to visit evilgeniusentertainment.com for exclusive content, swag, casting call news, and much more.